Yeah, it's going to be recorded, I know, and then make this big. Okay, there we are. Welcome everyone to the N3, this is the very first, at least the first public version of the N3C orientation. And this is actually what we're calling the Session A orientation. When we were putting together sort of this idea of an orientation for N3C, we very quickly realized that there's just way too much information to stuff into one sort of sitting. And so we broke it up into two parts, a Session A and a Session B. And this one, Session A, is going to be mostly about the sort of like the high level of the data, and it's going to be sort of aimed at those with, well, pretty much everybody, but especially those who have research ideas and want to know whether or not N3C is right for your research questions. Session B is going to focus more on the technical topics of actually doing data analysis with N3C data. Both of these are useful sessions. I think even Session B for folks who are like crackerjack data scientists, because it turns out, as we'll see today, there are a number of specific things that you might want to get familiar with if you're going to be comfortable working with the N3C data. Before I go too much further, I want to say thank you a whole lot to the folks listed here. Knowledge about and within N3C is distributed across quite a large number of people in quite a large number of different locations. And these folks here really helped a lot with the information in this orientation. And we just really wouldn't have been able to do it without them. Kristen, Vera, Emily, Arza, Trisha, Alex. I'm Sean here, that's me. So many of these, I'll be doing a bunch of yakking, but most of these subject matter experts are present today. And so if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Hopefully folks will be able to answer them as we get to them. Periodically, there might be a stopping point or two when I'll try and remember to stop talking and see if there are any quick questions that we can answer along the way. But we've actually scheduled this for an hour and a half. So although I'm hoping to be done with the main part of this within an hour, we'll have some time afterward to do some Q&A and mingle and whatnot. Alrighty, these slides do have a number of links in them, and we're going to get you copies of the slides so that you have those links for your own use. And we're just kind of figuring out where to put those so that we can give you a link that everyone has access to. So expect that somewhere along the way while I'm talking today. All right. Right, so I think it's a good idea to review kind of the problem that N3C is addressing, which is that the US has no central electronic health record data repository, right? I mean, other countries have this and we do not. What we don't have is even really a standard model or format for electronic health record data. Different institutions are storing their own data for their patients, and they use different systems to do this with names like ACT or I2B2 or PCORNet. If you really want to get a lot of data together to analyze, as we do for COVID, this makes it really quite difficult to work with all this data comprehensively and consistently, not to mention how difficult it is to sort of like get access to all this data because there are legal requirements and red tape involved with getting access to any one of these data sets, never mind all of them. So what N3C is doing is we're recruiting what we're calling data partners around the country to collect COVID-related data into a single unified database and sort of model or format for that data. This is tricky because these source data formats are quite different. And even for a particular source data format like I2B2, there can be differences between different sites in how they choose to use that particular system and what data or how they choose to collect it. So the process is sort of taking all these disparate data sets and collecting them into this single unified one is known as harmonization. And there's a really amazing team of folks with N3C who specialize in just this. And they work quite closely with the data partners so that the data partners don't have to take on the massive burden of harmonizing the data. Rather, the N3C takes on the goal of harmonizing the data. The target data model that we're working with is known as OMOP, and you'll hear a lot about it in N3C because understanding OMOP is really the key to making sense of most of N3C's data. But it's not necessarily something that everyone has run across before, and so it is a little bit of a learning curve for many. Because this is sensitive data, we can't really redistribute it to researchers. Rather, what we do is we keep it under lock and key in what we call the data enclave, to which access is granted to research teams with fairly comprehensive access controls and processes for getting access to that data. This is yet another kind of a learning curve with N3C, because there are actually several steps involved with sort of getting access to that data, and some of those are regulatory, some of those are signing things and agreeing to things and filling out forms and so on. And lastly, because the data do live in this sort of secure cloud enclave, the tools to analyze it must live in the enclave as well. The good news here is that we do have the usual suspects like R and Python and SQL. And there are also some surprisingly powerful graphical analysis tools that you might want to check out as well. But as a matter of legality, we do have to be extremely cautious with data protection, even within the enclave. And so literally every bit of data and code and all the actions that are going on are tracked inside of there. So the interface that requires doing all this is quite a bit different than a lot of data scientists are used to. So if you are data scientists and you're used to working in Jupyter Notebooks or RStudio, we don't have those tools because they can't do all that data tracking. There are a bunch of customized tools within the enclave for this analysis that support Python and R and some GUI analysis tools. And that's kind of another learning curve. So if all these, I've mentioned sort of like 3 learning curves, which I think kind of is how I think of things. You got this sort of like organizational learning curve, you've got the data model learning curve, then you've got the tools learning curve. If all that sounds daunting, don't worry about it. We have a ton of resources to help you, and we are developing more all the time. The N3C community is also really wonderful and super supportive. All right. So what's actually in the data? So this is a screenshot of the dashboard, a dashboard that talks about the data. We currently have 39 data partners contributing data on 2.7 million patients, about 500,000 of which are COVID positive. Notice there's a little star there. It turns out that even something as simple as like which patients are COVID positive or have been COVID positive is not necessarily the simplest thing. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But you've got various PCR tests, you've got antibody tests, you've got ICD-10 codes for COVID positive, and so on and so forth. So that's why there's a little star there. And then when the harmonization team is working with the data partners, they're not pulling data for every patient at every data partner. Rather, they're pulling it for all the COVID positive patients, according to this particular complex definition, as well as twice as many demographically matched control patients. I put the word control here in quotes because it's worth keeping in mind that although N3C is trying to collect as disparate and diverse and comprehensive data as we can, that's kind of the point, these are not random samples, right? This is not a random sample of any particular population. And so selection bias is something that you'll probably be thinking about as you're doing your research and you're thinking about these data. Although I just said that, you might notice that these numbers here, 2.7 million and 516,000, are not in that 2-to-1 ratio, right? And so that's sort of a discrepancy. And what that is that's actually because not all of the data partners have sort of updated to the latest definition of that data pool, which defines that 2-to-1. So as time goes on, these numbers will become more in alignment as more data partners move to this relatively new within N3C data definition, or cohort definition as they define it. This, what I really want to highlight about this is that the N3C data is really dynamic. It can and does change as data partners come on, as we adjust the needs of the researchers or the needs of N3C to the ongoing pandemic. But all older versions of the data are kept for reproducible research versions. So what I'm showing here is the current release, but there are previous releases, and every release is tracked so that you can always go back and see what your data looked like 6 months ago or whatever it was. These releases are done about once a week is the refresh. All right, so for the patients that are defined as being part of a release, we don't grab the entire patient history either. Rather, what we do is we grab pretty much everything we can going back to January 2018 for a fairly recent historical snapshot of these particular patients. The second row of this dashboard down here summarizes a few of the tables that are defined by that OMOP standard. So we have information on which sort of procedures patients got and when they got them, lab results, what drug exposures, visits, all kinds of stuff like that. And you can see that we've got a lot of really good, yummy data stored up in this secure cloud enclave. So even that's not the whole story though. Not every research project is gonna need access to every patient detail, right? So we've actually set up 3 different levels of data inside the enclave with different access requirements. I'm going to apologize here for the small text on this slide and maybe a few other slides too. This particular one is straight from this governance link down here, and I'm not at liberty to paraphrase. So it is what it is, and we kind of get to work with it. So the most complete data are what we call the level 3 data, also known as the limited data set or LDS. And this is pretty much the rawest form of the data. It does include 2 protected health information fields defined by HIPAA. Those are the dates of service and the patient zip codes. It doesn't include a lot of other protected health information fields like, names, birth dates, stuff like that, but those 2 are in there. We also have what we call the level 2 data or the de-identified data. And this is pretty much the exact same data, except those dates of service are randomly shifted to protect patient privacy, generally plus or minus 180 days. And the patient zip codes are truncated to just 3 digits rather than a full 5-digit zip code. And that takes those 2 protected health information fields defined by HIPAA and makes them no longer protected health information fields defined by HIPAA. This random date shifting here might be concerning to you, but there's good news here, which is that the dates are randomly shifted per person. What that means is, although you don't know when things happen within the year, it is still possible to go in with this level 2 data set and say, hey, I need to access all of the patients who had a particular drug within 10 days of a COVID lab test positive result. And you'll be able to identify those data, even though the dates have been shifted because they've been done on a per person basis. Lastly, there's the level 1 data, which is known as the synthetic data. This data set is a little bit different in that it doesn't contain actual patient data. What it contains are data which are derived from a statistical model based on the level 3 data. So they are, if you will, synthetic. Whereas the level 2 and level 3 data are in that OMOP format that I mentioned, the synthetic data is in a simpler single table format, and so it's a little bit easier to get started, but it's also quite a bit different from the original raw data that you get in level 2 and level 3. So these 3 levels are available to different categories of researchers. So sort of going from top to bottom here, the level 3 data is only available to researchers from US-based institutions. The level 2 data is available to researchers as well from foreign research institutions. And down here, the synthetic custom synthetic data sets are also available to citizen scientists. And these are basically folks who don't have a research institution to affiliate with, they're sort of average Joes off the street who want to get access to some really cool data and do some analysis. Where these 3 different levels of data really differ are in the access requirements, and that's sort of why we've made these 3 different levels. Even the level 1 data has quite a number of different access requirements. The first thing you got to do to access the level 1 data is you got to register with N3C. So you go to a website, you sort of fill out a form, you put in your name and maybe your Slack email or something. Then you got to get an account for that data enclave so that you can log into it. Once you're able to log into the data enclave, then you've got to submit a DUR, which is a data use request, which is basically saying, hey, can I actually access the data? There's a couple of prereqs for a couple of these steps. So in order to get an account with the data enclave, you have to have a data usage agreement signed and executed with NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which is part of NIH. And then to complete the DUR process, even for this synthetic data set, you have to complete, I think it's like a 90-minute IT security training that's offered by NIH, and upload your sort of certificate of completion for that. The level 2 data have all of the same requirements, but there's an additional requirement that everyone accessing it have completed the human subjects research protection training, sometimes known as CITI training for human subjects research protection. It's the long one. It can take quite a number of hours to complete. You may have already completed it, and you want to have your completion date handy because you're going to need to enter that completion date when you're submitting that data use request. What can I say? Oh, it has to be within the past 3 years, I think. And then lastly, for that level 3, that most secure version of the data, you have to do all of that, and you're going to need a local IRB board to review your project and come up with a determination letter that you can upload along with your request as well. So I would say, you know, talking about these 3 levels of data, remember that this level 2 data, these dates of service being shifted, doesn't really stand that much in the way of quite a number of analyses. And you really only need the level 3 data if you need very precise location, 5-digit zip codes, or you need like dates of the year. So you need to know when things were happening across the course of the pandemic, as opposed to relative dates for an individual person. Mostly we're going to talk about those level 2 and those level 3 data, but I did want to give a little bit of a quick summary of that synthetic data before we move on. This is a screenshot of a synthetic data table. I actually got special permission to show this for this orientation. Generally, screenshotting row level N3C data is a no-no, so don't do that. What's interesting about this table is that it's created with a specific question in mind. You know, in this case, for evaluating COVID along social factors like income and poverty and so on and so forth. And that's because the statistical model generating those data aren't built from all of that original data. Rather, what they do is they pick out some specific columns of interest for a particular question of interest. They pull those out, and then they build a statistical model on that, and then create that synthetic data. So this is an example of release notes that come along with a synthetic data set that sort of describe which original data went into that statistical model that then generated the synthetic data. The synthetic data generation process is handled by a company called MD Clone, and they've been kindly provided us some links describing how it works, which I've put here. You might very well be wondering whether or not this whole synthetic data generation process accurately reflects the data for our N3C data and gives you, you know, good answers on the other side. Unfortunately, N3C has a team of folks, a group of folks working on the synthetic data validation topic. So there are people who are sort of evaluating synthetic in comparison to the original data to see how similarly this whole thing works. All right. Since we are at about 20 after already, I'm going to take a quick look at the chat and see if there are any quick ones that I can address. Some of these I'm going to, you know, not address, and we can talk about it after the fact. The 2.7 million patients have been tested. I believe that, yes, they have. I think, and some of this we'll see a little bit later, some links for getting details about exactly how that data is pulled and what's defined on that. But I believe that they are presumed either tested negative or presumed negative by some criteria. Oh, Richard answered it. Thank you, Richard. Can we access to see preliminary counts for feasibility? Access for preliminary counts for feasibility. I don't know the answer to that one. I mean, we have sort of like high level counts that are publicly available, like that dashboard that I showed. But in terms of, can I get a quick review of how many COVID positive patients took this particular drug? I'm not sure that we can do that. But maybe we can connect you with somebody who's interested in, or who might be able to help with such questions. Okay. So
Sean,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. I just pasted a link, which is outside the Enclave dashboard that has some stats about the data in there. So maybe that helps for like the feasibility questions.
Awesome. Thanks. I'll have to add that at some point. So I'm going to continue on. We're in kind of a boring part of this presentation. It will get more excited, I hope, I promise. We talked a little bit about all these acronyms, right? The DUR and the DUA, and I want to spend a little bit more time on that because it does trip people up. So the DUA is, I mean, you should read it. You will have to read it, but it's more or less an agreement to behave. It's the do's and the don'ts of the data. The data are for COVID research only. You can't go in and start asking other questions and doing other research. Thou shalt not attempt to re-identify patients. Thou shalt not share data. This stuff is, very highly secured. Everything that happens in the enclave is logged, and so on and so forth. And this is a legally binding agreement that you're going to need to be covered by in order to get access to the data. The easiest way to do it, however, is to actually have your institution sign this DUA on behalf of all the employees, students, or whatever at that institution. So far, we've got 150 institutions which have signed this data usage agreement on behalf of all their folks. And you can see a list of them here. So you might already be covered by a DUA and not realize it. If you're not, we're happy to work with your institution to get that process in place to make it easy for everybody at your institution to access N3C data. Individuals will need to sign, citizen scientists will need to access as well, but they're going to have to do it directly with NIH NCATS. And we do have a few folks who have done that, but by far the most common way to get access is via this institutional DUA. Okay, so at the end of the day, getting access to the enclave requires registering with N3C, after which someone at N3C will confirm that you are indeed covered by a DUA. Once you've registered and we know that you're covered by a DUA, your account will be sort of turned on to access the enclave. When that happens, you should get an email with some information about logging in, or you can go straight to the enclave at unite.nih.gov and try and log in with your login credentials. But although those 3 levels of data that we've been talking about are stored in this enclave, getting access to the enclave doesn't automatically give you access to those data levels. Instead, the way it works is for research projects, which you can basically think of as folders, get access to the data as configured by N3C admins, right? So we might say, all right, this particular research project needs level 1 data, this particular research project needs level 2 data, and so on and so forth. And users then get access to those projects and thereby get access to the data through those projects. Now, getting access to a project or creating a new project and getting access to that, that's where it comes in for filling out that data usage request or DUR form, and that happens inside of the enclave. You can think of, if it helps, each project being associated with a single DUR, which describes, the project rationale, which level of data the project needs access to, other things about the project. And every person who wants to access that project signs on to that same DUR. These DURs then, sort of go into a queue and they're reviewed by a data access committee for appropriateness. Potentially they might say, gosh, you requested level 3, but we really think that you could get your work done with level 2. So we've enabled that. You can appeal for level 3 if you want it, or something like that. And that's how that works. We do figure that you'll want to start playing with data and tools as soon as you're able to log into the enclave, though. And so we've included some learning data. This is publicly available data in that OMOP format known as SynPUF, or synthetic public use files. These aren't locked down in any way, but don't get them confused with the synthetic data down here. That's definitely a different thing than the SynPUF learning data. Okay, so before going much further, I'm going to take a peek at the enclave itself. This is the enclave homepage. Look, there's our dashboard, which is sitting there on the enclave homepage. As Saad noted, it's also available. Some of that information is also available outside of the enclave. There are a few specific things here on the enclave homepage that are worth mentioning here in our orientation. First is that the N3C has a number of different ways to get help. Some of the ways to get help are within the enclave itself. So if you have a question that deals with patient data, that's not something that we want to address outside of the secure environment of the enclave. So there's actually a help system within the enclave for those kinds of questions. However, if you have a question about, hey, I can't log into the enclave, you're obviously not going to ask about that within the enclave. And so there's also a help desk that exists outside of the enclave. And that's a great place for pretty much everything that isn't specifically data or code related. So just be aware of that. Second, I want to highlight the training section of the Enclave homepage, which links to a lot of resources, stuff about OMOP, stuff about the tools in the Enclave, stuff about things that are specific to N3C. So be sure to check those out, especially the training portal, which is still in development. There's information there that will really supercharge your data analysis once you get in there. And some of this information is also available outside of the Enclave under that help desk as well. We mentioned the DUR sort of process where you sort of submit the form and then it goes through the queue and the DAC approves it and then it goes and so on and so forth. These three buttons here on the Enclave homepage, they're the ones that deal with DUR management and project access management. There's quite a lot there because there's so many steps and convoluted parts to the DUR process. So I'm not going to cover it here, but I will note that there's a tutorial about it. There's actually one called Enclave Organization, available both inside the Enclave under training and then outside the Enclave at this link here. And it covers this DUR process in some detail, as well as some other cool things about the Enclave that you may want to know. While I'm here on this screenshot, over here on the left navigation bar, we've got sort of a variety of analysis tools that we can use. And then there's this handy projects and files button where you can click to access projects and files. All right, everybody likes screenshots, so I'm going to give you guys a few more. So if we were to click on that projects and files button, the first thing that we would see is the projects tab. Again, you can think of each project sort of as a folder, which has access to different sets of data. Most of these projects are N3C research projects associated with the DUR. Those are the ones that begin with RP. And the information here comes from the DUR that was associated with that research project. There are some request access buttons here, but you should probably ignore those. Those are left over from the sort of interface, but they're not tied into the DUR process. If you need to access a project space, you need to fill out a DUR, and these buttons won't take you to the DUR. If you click on that, it'll basically just send you and tell you to go click on those buttons on the homepage that I mentioned. Also under the projects and files, we can click on the data catalog. Data catalog contains data collections. Data collections are just curated sets of read-only data that make it easy for you to find stuff. So if you happen to be in a project that has access to the level 2 data, you'll see the de-identified data catalog show up here, and you could go into there and see the tables associated with the level 2 data. There's another data catalog that contains sort of more applications and file-y kind of stuff. So dashboards, tools to help understand analyses and things like that. Moving on to some analysis tools. Contour, which I'm showing here and is accessible via the link there, is a graphical user interface for sort of basic data manipulation, like filtering, joining, manipulation, visualization, date arithmetic, stuff like that. It is a graphical user interface, and hardcore coders might turn up their nose at it a little bit, but I think there are some really good reasons to get familiar with this particular tool. For one thing, it knows how to efficiently work with 3 billion rows of data automatically. That's something that you might have to deal with when you start dealing with data analysis, is that there's quite a lot of data, and that's a big data scale kind of thing. But this tool sort of handles that for you. It can do pretty much anything SQL can do, which is great. And then when you do get down to a nice filtered, smaller, processed, clean data set that you're ready to do statistical analysis on, you can export that result from this tool and then import it into other tools and deal with it with R, Python, or SQL, or whatever. And then speaking of which, this is the code workbooks tool. I sort of cut off the menu over here. But this is a hybrid interface for writing data analysis code in R, Python, or SQL. Each node here is essentially either a table which has been imported from one of the data sets, or a function written in R, Python, or SQL, which takes in some tables as inputs and produces a table as an output. And so you kind of get this like table computational flow graph thing going on, which is very cool. And you can, along the way, produce visualizations with your favorite plotting libraries in R or Python. Something briefly to note is when you are working in the code environment, if you haven't pre-filtered your data to be reasonably small, and you're going to work with very large tables, you might be working with Apache Spark libraries. And that's a distributed high performance computing framework that enables working with these very large data sets. And it is sort of the foundational layer of the secure data enclave. All right. Before I'm signed out. Let me briefly check some chat. And actually, Tricia, is there anything that you noticed in chat that would be good for me to address, or are Richard and our other subject matter experts handling it pretty well?
Richard is answering quite a few questions. I did see one, where could I check if I meet the requirement of different access levels on my N3C data account dashboard?
That sounds to me like a DUR question. So if you have access to the enclave, then the only way to get access to the data and to determine whether you have access to the data is to fill out a DUR and successfully fill out all the forms. And when you do that, it'll go into a review queue. And if it gets rejected, then the data access committee will tell you why. But essentially, you won't be able to request access to the data until you have the information necessary. And so I think the short answer is there's the DUR form, which you can go and check out that Enclave organizational video, and that'll show you what exactly you're going to have to put into that DUR form in order to get access to those data.
There was another one, hopefully Richard hasn't answered it yet. Can I amend a DUR after it has been approved?
That is rare, and it's not something we have an automated workflow about that I'm aware of. Every once in a while, it has happened where a project has said, gosh, you know what, we thought we needed level 2, but we really need level 3. At that point, you almost, I think we have people sort of submit a special request ticket, and then it goes through a process by which the powers that be help make it happen, but it's a custom kind of thing. So think hard about the kind of data use request that you want, because it's not easy to change after the fact.
And oftentimes, Sean, for upgrade requests for getting a higher level of data access, we've seen people just submit new DURs and it goes through the approval committee.
That makes sense. All right, so I'm going to dive back in here, and we'll get theoretical again for a minute. How do I? So we talked a lot about OMOP, and that it's a big part of N3C, is that's what the level 2 and the level 3 data are about. But you know, what is OMOP? Well, OMOP was the result of something called the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership. And that was a project to do pretty much exactly what N3C now has a need for, which is to collect disparate health data into a unified data set. The original project ended in 2013, and since then, the core data model has been stewarded by the Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics Collaborative, or OHDSI, pronounced Odyssey. Really big worldwide group of folks who are working on this issue of healthcare data interoperability. If you're already familiar with other electronic health record systems, but not OMOP, it might take a little bit of getting used to depending on where you're coming from. So OMOP is designed with data analysis in mind, whereas many data systems are designed for internal purposes like billing, right? So you're going to see sort of potentially different things than what you're used to, driven by that. For the most part, the OMOP community strives to default to data and privacy protection, so they try not to include stuff like names and birth dates. But there, can be exceptions where warranted, and that's sort of a philosophical OMOP thing. The data are stored in tables, and OMOP tries to be a person-centric model, meaning each row is associated with a person and, whenever possible, a date, so that we really want to know, what happened to who when. And so you're going to find rows or columns indicating which person and date a thing is about. So to give an example of that, this is a screenshot from that SynPuff learning data table. And you can see that there's a column for person ID. There's another table of person, which describes details about person ID 4, person ID 5, person ID 7, and so on and so forth. This table has a drug exposure start date and an end date, so you can see, when they started and stopped that particular drug. And the drug that they took is described by this drug concept ID, which is a numeric identifier. Now in the N3C data, this isn't like an OMOP thing, but N3C has made a few additions. And one of those additions is that there's another column further down the table, which is a human readable version of what this drug concept ID describes. But when you're actually doing data analysis, you're not really going to use that human readable version all that much, if at all, because these drug concept IDs are really powerful and meant to be used for data analysis. To talk a little bit more about that, OMOP concepts, which are basically all the different things that you could put an ID on, like pneumonia or a particular antibiotic or so on and so forth, they're leveraged from existing vocabularies. So OMOP didn't really feel like, even though they were collecting lots of different data into one single data source, they didn't want to reinvent any wheels and start coming up with brand new codes for things. They reused codes that are out there, like the ICD-10 code for pneumonia. But every code that's out there in all these other systems is also given an OMOP specific ID. And that's, a big long numeric number. When you're working with the data tables, because the data comes from all these different source sites, the original data values that came from those source sites are kept. So you will have sort of a source columns in there that describe the original data as it was in the source data set. But those terms are actually mapped to a set of standards identified by OMOP for analysis. So if I go back here, these drug concept IDs are a subset of the IDs that are preferred by OMOP as a standard representation for that particular concept. So there might be 15 different ways to code pneumonia across all the different systems in the world. But as far as OMOP is concerned, you only need one to do analysis with. A really powerful thing that OMOP provides, and this is a huge amount of work by this very large Odyssey community, is a hierarchy of relationships between the terms that are identified as standards. So there's a table in there, sort of a OMOP metadata table that says, hey, Proquin XR, which has ID 129654432, has ingredient ciprofloxacin, and ciprofloxacin is an antibiotic. And so you can actually use this hierarchy information to define a set of related things that you want to pull out of the data. So if you want to say, hey, I want to get all the patients who had any kind of antibiotic, you can go in there and you can use this hierarchy to identify all the different standard terms that are kinds of antibiotics. And this is called a concept set. It's a pretty important concept in the enclave, and so I'm highlighting it in blue here. This would normally be tricky, right, to sort of like deal with this giant hierarchy of terms. So fortunately, Odyssey and N3C as well have developed some really great tools for working with these concept sets in the hierarchy and OMOP data. And there's some information about that in the training portal where you can go and sort of figure out how to develop a concept set and use it in an analysis. One thing you don't want to go doing is sort of searching, doing text searches for Cipro or something like that in the data, because it might not be coded with the term Cipro in it. To give you an example of one of those custom tools that N3C has developed, this is the concept set browser. Here you will be able to browse around different concept sets that have been defined by others. There's another tool, an editor, where you can create your own concept sets and then define them and publish them. And N3C cares a lot about community-driven reproducible research. And these tools also include workflows for like getting expert review and publishing these important research artifacts. And we try as much as we can to help people avoid duplicating work across projects. All right, so that's OMOP in a nutshell. There's a bunch of information out there about OMOP. There's the Book of Odyssey, which is a really neat sort of historical look at OMOP and the community, as well as some technical documentation about OMOP. Eden Academy has some really great online courses, sort of like video-based courses that you can go and browse around. There are other tools, tutorials that have been published by Odyssey. And then I find this particular link kind of handy. I go and look for it a lot. It's the sort of description of the columns in the data tables. And so I just thought I'd put it here in case you find it handy as well. All right, so that's a brief stopping point. Tricia, any interesting questions or comments coming up that we should address live?
I am looking, I'm trying to keep track of the ones that have already been answered.
Richard or Saad or Devera, feel free to jump in with any high-level clarifying things. Cool. All right, thanks, Richard.
Yeah, it looks like they've all been answered on this section.
Awesome, you guys are the best. All right. So that's OMOP generally, right? But there's OMOP as used by N3C, and this is where it gets complicated because harmonizing data from lots of different sources is just a complicated process. The team that's working on this part of the pipeline run into things all the time, and they need to deal with them, right? There's messy data, there's differing units between different data sources, there's missing data sometimes, and data is just messy. So fortunately, these folks work really hard to put together the best comprehensive data set that they can. This includes a rather lengthy ingestion process, as well as various data quality checks and expert review and things of that nature. Even so, some things are just difficult by virtue of the differences in these source data models the data are coming from. Death information is a really great example. OMOP supports and technically even requires that death dates be and causes be included in the data, but other data models don't necessarily. Some of them require a date of death, others don't. Some of them support cause of death, some of them don't. So death data in particular is something that's a little spotty in the enclave, mostly because it's spotty in the source data that we're getting information from. And then there are other things like, defining COVID positive. There are a lot of different PCR tests, and there are a lot of different antibody tests. And when recording the results, different systems use different codes, which need to be considered, elevated or high or present. And then there are sort of ambiguous ones like presumed positive and things of that nature. And then, of course, there's the ICD-10 code for COVID-19 U07.1. That's handy, although it wasn't in regular use in early 2020. And so we don't even necessarily have that as a solid thing to rely on. Fortunately, however, getting COVID positive information inside the enclave isn't too hard because we already do have some defined concept sets and code templates that you can make use of to sort of pull out COVID positivity just like that dashboard does. This is an interesting slide from a recent symposium on the N3C data. So prior to the symposium, they did a quick straw poll of some researchers and some data partners to see what kinds of data were a priority for researchers and how hard those data are to collect from the data partners. This is just a quick review of the results shown. And it's basically worth noting that, some stuff is easy, some stuff is hard, and it's not necessarily in direct alignment with what we would want to know. Some things are hard just because something like pregnancy, there's about a bazillion different ways to note pregnancy and different stages of pregnancy and the way that people can interact with the healthcare system when they're pregnant. So with all that said, you might want to actually take a look at your results or your analyses and see how they break down by that data partner, right? Like, does this particular data partner give me way different results than if I had done my analysis on that particular data partner? Although we don't share which data comes from which particular data partner, you can still group by these data partners because every table has a data partner ID column. So you can group by them and you could say, well, site 732 seems to be missing all of its death data. And so I'm gonna note that in my particular analysis, or maybe exclude that site because I'm doing an analysis based on death. There are other sort of known persistent issues that are part of this harmonization process. Some of them are specific to sites, some of them are general. You can go and check out sort of a running log of them via this link here. This is within the enclave. And if you do find something strange in the data, you think maybe this is an issue with the data or something that got missed, do please go and report an issue about it in the enclave, or even if you just have a question about data and you're not sure. These are data questions, so they're good to be addressed within the secure enclave, and you can go under the help and support link in the lower left menu, and then the report an issue. And that's where you can sort of note like, hey, this table looks a little wonky. Is that supposed to be that way or not? That's also linked from the other help and support information that I showed earlier in this presentation. All right. So getting sort of to the wrap up now, I talked a lot about data, but N3C is so much more. It's so much more. It's really a great community. There's a lot of people. We have over 1,200 registered users and N3Cers, almost 1,000 of whom have access to the enclave. There are 120 or more research projects ongoing that have DURs that have been approved. We've got 120, actually no, more, 150 institutions who have signed those data usage agreements, and more are coming online all the time. And earlier we saw that there were 39 data partners that were contributing data that were already in there, but there are actually 75 data transfer agreement signatories. And so you can expect the N3C data to continue to grow pretty significantly as more and more people get their ingest pipeline set up and the data starts being staged into the enclave. There's a lot of communication that goes on with N3C. Slack is pretty popular and active. There are over 30 Slack channels, some of which deal specifically with particular research projects. Some of them are just great places for Q&A about OMOP and so on and so forth. Google Groups and Google Drive is a very common tool to use across N3C. And just in case you didn't have enough Zoom meetings on your calendar, there are 20 to 25 of them that you can sign up for in N3C. And you can see all those in N3C calendar, which I've linked right there. All right, so N3C as an organization, I think deserves a little bit of a breakout because it's a complicated thing. There are lots of teams, lots of roles, lots of things going on. And so I put together this sort of map of N3C, and this is unofficial. This isn't like something that has been passed by anybody and reviewed, and I just sort of put it together. So we have these 5 what we call work streams, and these were the original things that we figured N3C were going to need to do when we started up N3C. And the different work streams obviously have different subgroups and committees and things like that. So, for example, loosely under the definition of data partnership and governance, we have like a publications committee. So N3C requests that if you're going to publish based on N3C data, you do appropriate attribution, and in fact, ideally, maybe this is a requirement, you should fill out a publication form so that others know what it is that you're working on. And if they're interested in your project, they can get a hold of you and say, hey, I'm kind of curious about your project. Do you need help? Or, oh, I see someone else is already going to publish on this particular thing. Maybe I'll go and see if I can find another area to publish on. We have a really great set of project managers and admin team who I know quite well. The synthetic data work stream, there's a synthetic data validation group. They're working on that question of, is the synthetic data sort of like meaningful and giving us the same answers as the real data? And then I tend to think of the research projects as living under this sort of collaborative analytics work stream. So this is a hypothetical research project here. Maybe some group is interested in studying heart disease and COVID-19. But that's probably not the most interesting thing that goes on under the collaborative analytics label. there's this idea of domain teams, and domain teams are basically topical organizations of people interested in similar things. So there's a domain team about diabetes and obesity, and there's a domain team about immunocompromised or immunosuppressed individuals in COVID-19. And a domain team, in theory, could actually be associated with multiple projects in the enclave, right? So the immunosuppressed or immunocompromised domain team might have a project going on, involving HIV patients. Another project might be involving autoimmune skin disorders. And this is really a way for researchers to help find each other and to sort of cross-pollinate communication. So domain teams generally meet regularly. They have a Google group, maybe they have a Slack channel or something like that. And so, this particular research project who's dealing with heart disease may well have wanted to get involved with the domain team for diabetes and obesity, because those folks probably know a lot of information that would be useful for their research, and vice versa. Or potentially, these guys decide that it's too different from diabetes and obesity, but I think a lot of other people would be interested in cardiovascular disease and COVID-19. Maybe I'll propose spinning up a new domain team so that other people can find me and we can communicate more effectively. Those are the clinical domain teams. We also have some what we call cross-cutting domain teams. So there's these are less about sort of like clinical patient populations and more about techniques or tools or additional data. So there's a domain team that's sort of focusing on machine learning techniques in COVID. There's a domain team interested in looking at genomic data and associated with all this other electronic health record data. There's a group of folks known as data liaisons, and they come from, I believe, both the phenotype and data acquisition stream and the data ingestion and harmonization stream. And these people are the people who are doing a lot of that validation of the ingestion and the harmonization, and they know the data really, really well. And so they are great people to go for questions about the data, about OMOP, and so on and so forth. One of the great things about being in a domain team is that N3C actually has official support set up for domain teams from certain other parts of N3C. So for example, if you're in a domain team, there is a data liaison for the immunosuppressed or immunocompromised domain team who is there to answer those particular questions. Whereas if you're sort of off doing a research project on your own, it's a little bit harder to get access to some of those resources. Similarly, the project management administration team can help domain teams with things like scheduling and so on and so forth. All right, so that's a lot of stuff for an orientation. I hope that it's been useful for you. I hope it was new information for you, at least some of it. If you're just getting started, you might be wondering, well, where should I go next? You should definitely go and register, and there are a few steps involved with registering, and so there's some information about doing that here under the For Researchers link on the main CD2H site. You should check out the domain teams to see what kind of research is already going on in there and what sorts of people you could contact. And if you're interested in a research area, feel free to get a hold of the domain team leads. That's sort of their role, is to sort of, be there for people to connect and get into N3C research. Get access to the enclave, browse around, especially that SynPuff learning data. If you don't yet have a DUR, definitely check out the training portal, which has information that you can do, and you can do sort of practice analyses on that SynPuff data. And then, of course, we're going to have our orientation session B, where we're going to get into many of the technical tools and analysis and how to deal with these crazy OMOP things and everything else. All right. That is all that I have for our orientation presentation. It's 8:56. I feel pretty good about it. Tricia, any good questions?
Well, there's been quite a few questions that have been answered. So I'll give you one or two, but then I think what we're going to have to do is ask after those questions that if you did put a question in and it didn't get answered, we'll just have you speak up. It's been fast and furious, and the
Awesome.
SMEs have been answering questions.
That's good.
Yeah. And just speak up if I ask a question that's already been answered. Is it possible to link level 3 data with external data like registry data?
So there is, how do I want to say this? it is possible to link level 3 or any level of data with external data. However, when you start connecting level 2 data or level 3 data with external data sets like, poverty data or income data or stuff like that, there's a potential to escalate the security level of that data. So data that was previously de-identified might be more easily to re-identify once you connected it with some other data set. And for that reason, there is a process by which you can sort of propose, hey, I'd like to have this particular data set loaded into the enclave so that I can link this data with it and do analysis with it. The nice thing about going through that proposal process is that you fill out a few things and somebody goes and ingests that data, and then it's available to everybody. So there are some already vetted external data sets that have been staged in there that you can link against. If you have others that you want to add, there's a process for doing that. I don't have the link handy, but maybe it's there. And if anyone knows any more about that, feel free to pipe up.
Quickly before we move on, I just wanted to mention that we put a survey link in the chat for you all. In order to improve this, we really want your feedback. And so if you could take a second to fill that out, it's pretty brief, but it'll help us out. So thanks.
And I think at this point, after scanning through the questions, if you don't feel that your question got answered, this would be the time to unmute your mic and ask it.
I had a question regarding access to this, your presentation. By the way, it was very good and helpful. Many my colleagues couldn't make it as they're practicing doctors. Was there a way I can host it locally so that they can view it in their leisure? Or
so we will have the I think we shared the PDF.
Yes, I'll put it in again.
Drive, let us know, and we can host it somewhere else too. We will be doing these orientations sort of on a rotating schedule. So we're going to do session A this week. Next week we'll do session B, and then the intention is to do session A again for brand new N3Cers. After that, we'll sort of alternate back and forth between them. This will be repeating, and it'll probably get better over time as we figure out what questions people really need to have answered.
What are we doing with the recording, Sean?
Right now, it's going to be used for internal review purposes, and potentially we'll figure out what to do with it beyond that.
thank you.
It looks like some folks have their hands raised.
Yeah, I see that. Shireen, you have a question? Shireen?
Hello. This is you. I have question on analyst tool. Beside the R, can we use another one?
Good question. So within the enclave, there are R, Python, and a dialect of SQL that's based on Apache Spark. Those are the only 3 languages. So if you're like into Julia, not going to happen. For R and Python, there are a whole bunch of libraries, something like 400 or 500 of the common data science libraries already installed. If there's a library that you need that is not installed, because sort of accessing libraries and data could be a security risk, that needs to be requested, and then the admin team will sort of review it, and assuming that there's nothing wrong with it and it is compatible with the enclave, they'll install it. So yeah, short answer, R, Python, SQL, lots of existing R and Python libraries, and you can request that others be installed.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question. Once you do the analysis and you have the visualization, is there a way you can download the visualization either to incorporate into your presentations for PowerPoint slides or add them into your own research papers that you intend to produce?
Richard, do you want to put it on?
Yeah, sure. So there's a tool inside the enclave called reports that you can add your visualizations to, which is nice because they'll sort of refresh when the data refreshes. We'll go over some of that in the next session. But then once you have all your stuff in a report, there's a way that you put the report in a sort of holding area and it gets approved for export. And then once it's approved for export, then you can actually download all the images that are in that report. So it kind of takes a snapshot to make sure that you don't have any row level data or and that you've censored everything properly.
You also mentioned that the data will be refreshed, right? So if I have something change, like my visualization changes because some new data came in, how can I fall back to the original one and compare it to what I have to see
So
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
every release, which comes out on Fridays generally, has a release version. So at some point you'll want to do a data freeze and just pin all of your analyses to a particular branch of the release. And then you'll know that the upstream data won't change under your feet.
All right, thank you so much.
Sean, there was a question about getting the chat questions from today posted. And I just wanted to suggest that we're going to go ahead and scrape those questions and put them in an FAQ and make sure that they're added. So we will, these are all wonderful questions and we'll definitely include them.
Awesome. Mateo, you asked in the chat, how do we contact the Slack workspace admin to have our institution enabled to join the Slack? So that's a great question. And it's one of those things that's not specifically about patient data or code. And so it's a good question for one of our outside the enclave support systems. And I'm actually going to this is really super useful. I'm going to share my screen again. If I were to go to, yes, that's the one I want to share. If I were to go to covid.cd2h.org, this is the main N3C website. And it's a little bit tricky to navigate, but one of my favorite pages is under support, the support desk right there. And one of my favorite links on the support desk are the support requests. So this will take you and open a ticket where you can say, you know, I want to create a new domain team. I'm having trouble accessing the enclave. I'm having, you know, information, whatever kind of question you have, support request on. So that one might go down here, request support, everything else. And you can put the information, say, hey, you know, we'd love to be able to get our institution signed into the Slack. The nice thing about submitting tickets this way is that they are sort of tracked, logged, and we keep track of how long things take to resolve. And there's a whole bunch of really great people who watch those and try and keep the response times down. So that's definitely the most robust way to get help about stuff if it's not specifically about patient data or code.
Awesome, thank you.
Since we have a little bit of time and we have folks here, I'm curious how many folks are brand new to the enclave by show of virtual handy thing. A handful. Looks like quite a number of people, you know, have logged in and have experience using it though. I hope that for those of you, and this is the first time we run it, and so some of you probably been working with N3C for a while and kind of came to see what the story was about with the orientation. I hope that it provided some useful information nevertheless.
Sean, it seems like there's still sort of a FAQ of my registration isn't working. How do I get in for the first time?
This would be the N3C registration.
Just like your, so I know from personal experience, we had a problem syncing the authenticator to get me logged in the very first time. And I was able to get help from Keats on that issue, but just in general, without sending emails directly to NIH people, what's the mechanism for my first login isn't working?
That support desk ticket system is probably the best one, I think. That said, the registration system and the sort of like accessing the enclave, because the way the registration works is that it's complicated, unfortunately. You sort of go to the system, you're like, okay, I want to register with N3C, and then it's like, okay, log in. And you're like, why am I logging in? Well, what it's doing is it's asking you to log in through your institution so that it can connect your institution account to N3C so that we know who you are. And once you have that done, then you can sort of give some information about yourself. So N3C doesn't manage your password. Your original, home institution manages your password. So you can sort of connect your institution account with N3C. If you don't have an institution account, then there's like a login.gov service where you can go and sort of connect that, create an account there, and then connect it in. And then once you get that sort of tied together, then you can continue on and request access to the enclave, which is part of the registration process. I was going to include some information about all of that here in the orientation, but it would have been like 20 minutes just talking about registration. And it is on the docket to create some documentation that more clearly defines the registration process, although the CD2H page under the Researcher Essentials has a variety of information as well.
Sean,
So, yeah.
I have a question.
Yep.
Hi, I think first time I just, my internet went down, so I got kicked out. When you mentioned that, most of the researchers are having the difficulty in finding, like mortality or inpatient and all that stuff, is there a place in the community or in the platform where we can discuss how, and learn from each other's processes, or everyone is doing it on its own?
I'm going to let Richard, yeah.
Slack, I think, is the best way to be like, hey, where can I find this? There's a general Slack channel, and then joining your domain team to get a little bit more specific
Okay.
is a good way to do that. I'd also sort of encourage people to take a look at our preprint, the cohort, our description of the cohort that's on medRxiv right now, and that'll give you an idea of the kind of data and the kind of analyses that are there. And if you can imagine that the cohort paper needed to do something in order to write that paper, then you know that it's already been done. And we're in the process of making all those individual pieces available to all the other projects as well.
Right. This is the one that was posted on January 13, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured that, that was more exciting part to kind of learn from, how you have done that. But I'll look into the Slack channel to see, if there is more description about it. Or
Definitely be sure to check out that training portal. As we've sort of onboarded people into N3C, the main stumbling blocks that people tend to find are dealing with OMOP and that sort of like hierarchy of terms and building concept sets and then relating them to the tables. And then just sort of navigating around the enclave because there's a lot of different places and the interface is pretty novel to most everyone.
I think I have done that. It's the analysis part and just making sure that, the analysis is valid, or, stuff like that. So, and for the Slack channel, it has to be with the same email that we are linked with N3C domain, or it can be any email address.
When you register, I believe there's a field where you enter the email that is your preferred Slack email.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And you can go, if you need to, you can go back to the covid.cd2h.org site and you can change your registration information. So if you decide you wanted to use a different email for your Slack, you can go back and edit your profile and change that.
There's also another person with their hand raised. I think Ruchi? Andre?
Oh no, this is from the previous hand raise that you had asked if someone was totally new. Sorry, I think I need to get it off.
No problem.
So even though I've done a lot of talking, please don't come away with the impression that I know everything N3C. I'm really just kind of faking all that. The subject matter experts that are here and everyone else, Saad, Richard, Emily, Devera, Kristen, these folks know their stuff in N3C, and there's a lot of information that's spread around. And so, half the battle is sort of figuring out who to ask the question is, and that's partially why we have office hours. So on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 a.m. Pacific time, you can stop by the office hours. They're linked on the help desk page as well. And you can kind of just chat. I usually hang out in there. Saad sometimes hangs out in there. And that's a good place to ask questions. And we usually don't know the answer to the questions, but we can usually find the person who has the answer to the question. So.
And Sean, there's a lot of people who are know a lot of stuff about N3C, but it's wonderful that you have put this training together, and you know a lot.
Try. It's not possible to know everything if I try.
No,